Professor McGray has long been a teacher and a mentor of mine, and actually served on my doctoral committee. And so I've always enjoyed our conversations, and I've always learned something, and I'm always looking forward to what he has to throw out to us next. So today, Professor McGray is going to be speaking about the return of interference in sovereign affairs and international law. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he is a full professor at the Faculty of Law at McGill University, where he holds the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law. He also serves as the co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and he previously held the William Dawson Scholar position and the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. He has a very long and distinguished list of publications. He has spoken in many places. He has been honored by royals around the world. And so I do hope he blushes a little bit. I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say today. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kruzi. Delighted to be here and to give this presentation today. This is based on a small book that I'm trying to write when I find the time on interference in international law. This is obviously something on which quite a lot has been written about. I mean, but some of it is starting to date a bit. So, you know, non-interference was a big theme in international law in the 60s and 70s, maybe, then went out of fashion. And what I'm going to talk about is why the topic is being rediscovered and what it means that it's being rediscovered now and how we might want to think about it. So it's a return, but I guess partly the argument is that interference never entirely went and is in fact a defining feature of international relations, but also a remarkably elusive topic. So I think, you know, there's scholarship in international law has been very dominated, for example, understandably by the study of the use of force in international law, and even that, as we know, is an elusive task. But at least there's something, you know, it's hard to miss a use of force when one occurs. One might. Right. Whereas, you know, there's a sense in which interference is, you know, constant, all-encompassing, and hard to detect, and also that normatively a bit harder to pin down. So it's quite obvious what is wrong about aggression, you know, use of force. It's not always that clear what is wrong about interference. And I think, you know, one of the things I want to do with this project is not just look at the doctrinal dimensions of the norm of non-interference, but prod those a little to think about what our underlying normative theory of why interference is wrong and non-interference is good is. And I think there's, as you know, quite often in international law, of course, where as doctrinal international lawyers, we're used to think in terms of something about the microphone. No, isn't there a weird echo? Or is it just me? You can hear me okay, right? But so obviously we're trained to look for the practice and establish whether there is custom or not. But I think where, especially with an issue such as interference, it's hard not to think normatively in broader terms, right? So how does interference relate to sovereignty and more generally interaction in international affairs? So there's a rekindling of interest in interference. We'll get to this in a second. You'll know why, right? So interference in elections, for example, has been on a lot of people's minds. My concern always with these fads in international legal scholarship, they are fads, right? So you know there's going to be a lot of articles on this topic because it's the topic of a moment. I think I want to interrogate the moment a little bit, and I want to guard against the temptation, very strong amongst international lawyers, to always think that every topic that they put their mind to is new and sort of, they can examine it afresh, sort of disowning the multi-layered history that preceded it. So this is the sense I get from the scholarship on interference these days, is that scholars have a sense of wonderment about this new topic. You see this a lot with the focus on cyber interference, for example. So cyber interference, understandably, it's a really interesting issue, but it's focused a lot of attention. And that debate is occurring as if earlier debates from the 70s, from the 1920s, from the 19th century hadn't existed. So I think, we really owe it to this debate to contextualize it. And I guess, I'll get to this in a minute, but one of my suspicions is that interference has become very interesting, particularly in the West, as a result of changing patterns of interference. And there's a kind of amnesia involved, right? So we're rediscovering that interference can be problematic because it is now targeting elections in the US, for example. In the process, completely forgetting earlier arguments that were made, for example, by the Third World about how nefarious interference in their sovereign affairs is, and the extent to which the West has historically militated or engaged in interference and militated for quite narrow understandings of the norm of non-interference. So just as a reminder of that not particularly illustrious history, right? Interference has been the name of the game, right? In imperial context, it is what you did. I mean, at the time, of course, you wouldn't even call it interference because interference presupposes that you're dealing with an equal with a sovereign, right? You're colonizing, you're not interfering with the affairs of colonies. There are no affairs of colonies, right? Same thing with empires. Interfering is not really how we would put it, but, nonetheless, so even in the second half of the 20th century, even with states that had become independent, interference continued to be the defining pattern of relations between the center and the periphery. And we'll go on to see, but a lot of the new interference is very discrete, very diffuse, etc. I'd say some of the earlier interference really, wasn't that subtle. Like it didn't even have to bother. And so we're talking about coups, replacing elected, heads of state. Mossadegh is a good example. Recognizing rebel groups in states, in foreign states. In the course of conflict and gunboat diplomacy. So threats, making sure that states complied with what you expected of them by threat of force if necessary. Okay, so let's just keep this in mind in all of this debate and sort of take it in and see what kind of repercussions it might have for how we go on to conceptualize contemporary challenges of interference. All right, so the big story in international law against that background, right? The big step that's taken is a deliberate effort, largely a result of the Third World, to push back historically against interference, right? And for the newly acquired sovereignty to be defined by a strong simultaneous commitment to non-interference. And that's, something that the Third World really puts on the agenda that it theorizes, right? So it's against, obviously aggression and the use of force, intervention and interference, right? So I'll use intervention and interference as, is a a lot of terminological confusion around the two. Sometimes the two are confused. I guess intervention is the more canonical term, so it's the one on which there's most writing in international law. I'm mostly interested in interference as something that's harder to pin down. The point of intervention in the affairs of another state is it's typically understood to involve coercion. Interference doesn't necessarily involve coercion. It involves a kind of usurpation of another state's functions. And I think partly what makes it interesting is that precisely the fact that it's harder to pin down. So we can just accept this as a sort of baseline, right? The 1970s, if nothing else, stood for a really strong investment in the norm of non-interference. And it was one of these sort of deliberate exercises, right? I mean, not it's sort of instant custom, right? That this didn't really. I mean, you couldn't really say the norm of non-interference had emerged through customary international law because there was so much interference going on, right? I mean, there's non-interference in the affairs of some states, but interference in the affairs of others, right? So what the third world, I think, really does is it tries to put this on the agenda. It's the Latin Americans who spearhead the movement in the 1930s, first between themselves, but of course always with an eye to restraining their big neighbor to the north. So the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of States prohibits the interference with the freedom, the sovereignty, or other internal affairs or the processes of the governments of other nations. One thing that's really interesting about a lot of these efforts is they're constantly, as I think we all should, struggling to define what actually counts as interference, right? The word in itself doesn't fully disclose what it's about. And the challenge is it's a typical statutory drafting challenge, right? I mean, if you define interference too narrowly, if there's a chance that behavior we might consider problematic will fall outside the boundaries of a concept. If you define it too broadly, you trivialize the term. If everything is interference, nothing is interference, right? So you're kind of constantly struggling for sort of analytical trenchantity, and obviously a lot of this is very political. So I mentioned one of the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations, but many instruments of that era generally voted for with a majority, the kind of automatic majority that the Third World enjoys at the General Assembly at the time, emphasized, in quite solemn and broad terms, the prohibition on non-interference. No state or group of states has right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. Of course, armed intervention and mercenaries, for example, is a sort of emblematic issue at the time. So don't meddle and don't interfere even via private actors. So it's that whole dimension as well. No state may use or encourage the use of economic, political, or any other type of measure to coerce another state in order to obtain from it the subordination of the exercise of its sovereign rights and to secure from it advantages of any kind. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary, right? And I think a lot of this is sort of positive and coming from a right place, but how demanding it seems to be, right? And how, in some sense, idealistic, right? I mean, aren't states isn't this what states do all the time, right? Sort of try to use their advantages in the pursuit of their national interest, right? So isn't that definition perhaps too encompassing for its own good? Anyhow, that's that debate. Now, the West at the time is kind of wary of this non-interference agenda. This is very stylized. Right? The Third World is pushing against interference, and the West is, of course, not saying we should be able to interfere, but they're abstaining on some of these resolutions. Their heart isn't in it. Okay. I think in the 1990s, there's a sense in which that debate is eclipsed by other debates, right? So, look, new international order or whatever it was called. I mean, there's a sense of new beginnings. I think the Cold War was a sort of major reason why the norm of non-interference, assumed the role that it did, because obviously the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc were both very adamant that the other shouldn't be sort of infiltrating, the other's politics, etc. Right? So we forget this, but of course, the West had its own earlier encounter with interference. This is completely neglected in current debates. But the whole, McCarthyism and sort of early Cold War is about stopping the influence of the Soviet Union, including in cultural ways, including in all, there's cases on Soviet propaganda, being sent by mail to, US subscribers, and whether, that is a form of interference. But that debate remains a sort of fairly, all of these debates arise, but in ways that are often quite disconnected, and just not the same places, not for the same reasons. You can see over time, though, a sense that this, of course, states are quite obsessed with these things, right? I mean, sovereignty is about defining your sort of private sphere, in a sense, right? The sphere where you feel you should be able to do things without these external influences. But, states define this over time quite differently. So, I'd say interference still in the 1990s is kind of just is eclipsed, right? Partly because of this, commitment to common international norms, and in particular, the kind of exaltation of a discourse of human rights. And I think, the emergence of very strong winds sort of pushing the human rights agenda globally suggests much less room for a strong norm of non-interference, right? Because what do international human rights tell us? They tell us that, in fact, there is no issue that is fundamentally sovereign, fundamentally domestic, right? Everything is fair game because everything stands to impact human rights potentially. And therefore, there are no issues. Sure, I mean, sovereignty still has a role in mediating international demands and sort of local conditions, but there's really nothing that is completely beyond the concern of other states, right? And so I think human rights really justify considerable de facto interference or sort of meddling in what might previously have been understood as purely domestic affairs. So just because it's part of the picture and no one is talking about it doesn't mean it's not happening, and doesn't mean it doesn't continue to be problematic. And so I think really what's happening is where there's a repackaging of both interference and non-interference and the kind of investments that are being made in those concepts. So on the one hand, I think a lot of the old interference and the old concerns about interference never completely disappeared. They were just, the debates were different. I think they were toned down for a bit, but they were still there. So a good example is conditionality. So there's this whole debate in the 1990s about the extent to which the IMF in particular, but states as well, should be able to impose conditions when giving loans or development assistance. And if you read carefully, you can see this debate being formulated by those who are resisting conditionality, as a sort of new version of the interference, non-interference debate. So states in the global south, particularly in Africa, are saying, these loans are essentially interfering with our sovereign affairs, our ability to self-determine. And in conditions that are complex, right? Because they need the loans, right? So you kind of have to swallow the bitter pill of conditionality, but at the same time, you're kind of very aware of how you're in advance sort of legitimizing interference by donors in your sovereign affairs. So there's pushback there. Structural adjustment, same thing. You can see it again, but this wariness of these international Chicago or Washington experts descending on your capital and saying this is what you have to do, right? All in the name of sort of a neoliberal agenda. An interesting one, which is still ongoing, is unilateral sanctions. So, for example, Cuba has been saying for the longest time the unilateral sanctions adopted by the US, for reasons that we know, are actually a form of interference in its internal affairs. So it's a really interesting construction, right? The US argument typically is a very liberal argument to say, well, simply because we don't, like the whole point is we're not doing business with you. We're withdrawing, right? We're not engaging. How can that be interference, right? And, but the response, I mean, of Iran, Cuba, etc., is to say, well, actually, this disengagement because of structural power, etc., is preventing us from doing so many things. But it amounts to interference, right? You're interfering with us by not allowing us to engage with the world, by sort of isolating us. It's not a crazy construct, but it's really the object of a lot of contestation. So that's one part of the picture. It never went. It just went a little underground. There was this sort of ascendancy of this global discourse that emphasized, common values and, we can't possibly be interfering since we're only asking you to do things that we all agree, including you yourself, right, that you should be doing, right? So we're not really doing anything that you wouldn't have done yourselves. We're just, we're all in this together, okay? So that's one side. And I think this old interference, this constant background noise of interference is still there with us, okay? Even as we move on to what is, I want to describe as the new interference, okay? The new interference is the interference that we've been hearing a lot more of or about in the last decade. It's actually still pretty new, right? I don't think anyone saw this coming until the 2016 US elections, but this was a real sort of ongoing problem. It's this things have been unfolding very quickly. So what are the kind of the determinants of what I would describe as the new interference? Well, I think the first one is that for the first time, states that, I'm going to put this bluntly, that had historically been on the exporting end of interference, states that had interfered in the affairs of others, are suddenly feeling the sting of interference from others, right? So there's a real geopolitical, reversal of fortune of the concept, and this is changing the world. I mean, it's changing the world in many ways. I mean, you could say it's the same thing with the history of migrations. Migrations where sort of movement of persons was conceived in one way as long as it was, the white secular nations moving to the rest of the world. Once empires are dismantled and movement is south-north rather than north-south, all of a sudden the discourse changes completely. You'd say exactly the same thing is happening with interference. There was a discourse about interference and how, it wasn't that bad and it was part of, living sort of shared values and international law commitments in one era, and now this kind of brusque realization, but wait a second, this is really problematic. We don't want, people to be doing to us what we've been doing to them for, 150 years. I'm simplifying here, okay? But there's really a sense almost of surprise and kind of indignation, right? But this is, I'm not saying this to make a political point. I'm saying this to say, like, what I'm interested in is how the underlying political conditions in which these debates are formulated kind of tell us something about the kind of international legal direction they might take. I think this is an interesting moment, precisely because, you know, in a sense, there's a kind of give and take of interference, right? So you could be the interferer one day, but the one that's being interfered with the next day, and that forces you mentally to sort of adjust, you know, do a bit of intellectual gymnastics about what kind of position you want to emerge over time, right? In a context where I think a lot of this is still up for grabs, right? So we're not, obviously we're not slaves to international law. We're not just, you know, waiting for custom to emerge and then, oops, you know, it's crystallized, you know, this is what custom, we know that's not what happens, right? We invest, you know, states strategize, they try to push the norm in a certain direction, they argue for it, they argue against it, etc. Okay? So that's the first thing. So let's look at a few other dimensions, and you know we can discuss this at question time afterwards. If this new interference, but make it both a continuation of the interference that came before, but also interesting in novel ways. I think the first thing is traditional interference was very much imagined along sort of Westphalian lines, a state to state, right? One state is interfering in the affairs of another state. But, you know, if there's always an apt description, that's how the concept was understood. So increasingly, you have forms of interference that are not necessarily targeting the state, not directly, right? So if you're trying to influence, you know, political perceptions or the kind of informational environment in the state, it has implications for the state, but you're sort of almost bypassing the state, right? You know, even if you're interfering in elections, sure, you're interfering of something that falls broadly under the heading of sovereignty, but it's also much more diffuse, right? You're trying to reach directly to public opinions. You know, it's almost as if you don't even bother, like to engage in sort of a classic, you know, what we might think of as sort of classic interference, where you're sort of pressuring officials directly on the other side. So it's societal in terms of a target. It's also more societal or more private in terms of the origin of the interference. And that's one of the problems we have with kind of, you know, a lot of interference seems to emanate from groups that may be only loosely associated with the state, in some cases not at all, right? I mean, you know, we have, you know, groups that are active in cyberspace, for example, whose, you know, affiliation with the state is not always clear. Right? I mean, I think there are influence entrepreneurs that are basically non-state, and they might be conducive to a particular state's interest, but they have their own reason for sort of interfering with domestic processes. Another thing that's really, so the old interference was very outcome oriented, right? So the idea was that you would interfere to obtain, you know, a certain political outcome. So that, you know, a state would, you know, change its regime, etc. I think with a lot of the new interference, the outcome is not always very clear, right? So you have efforts to compromise the operation of democracy, for example, where it's not really clear what the intended result is. I mean, there's maybe the result is just you're corrupting the system, right? Like sometimes it's not clear whether the interferer wants a particular candidate to win in an election, for example, as opposed to just, it's not clear, right? I mean, as opposed to what? As opposed to maybe so distrust about democratic institutions, about or non-democratic or system of governance, right? But just disrupt processes rather than obtain always very, you know, a clear specific outcome. More decentralized, more privatized, and it is mediated by new technologies. I think the people who focus on cyber interference do have, you know, it's not just the novelty effect. I think, you know, the medium matters, right? So this is forcing us to answer difficult questions about what it even means to have a domestic sphere in a context where, you know, all of our public spheres are, you know, deeply embedded in global sort of global information infrastructure that's largely private. So, you know, some of the old, but a hefty dose of the new, and the new feels like interference, but we're not quite sure how to recognize it, what's wrong with it. But it's certainly raising a lot of, you know, red flags and alarm bells, right? So I think there's a realization that something is problematic. One of my concerns is that we don't have a very sound theory of why interference is problematic, because it's not absolutely clear what we think interference is interfering with. And that is what I'm going to move on to now. What I'm trying to do here is use the classic definition of intervention. So prohibited intervention in the domestic affairs of the state. Two elements, okay, you probably know from international law class. First, it has to be interference has to be in matters that are inherently domestic, right? So if it's a question of, you know, if, you know, it's a question on that has clearly been falls within the area of regulation of international law, let's say international peace and security, then you know, it's an inherently international issue. So how could, you know, it belongs to all states. So how could you possibly be interfering? I mean, it's a bit different if you're interfering with a particular state's foreign policy when it comes to international peace and security. Anyhow, so that's the challenge. So we have the second element of the definition is there has to be coercion. So I'll move to coercion in a second and what we make of that. But I just say that on that first level of the definition, we already have a bit of a problem, because our theory of what is domestic and what is international, internal, external, is pretty muddled, as it should be after, you know, a few decades of globalization and you know, all kinds of phenomena that have really reshuffled some of these categories. So it's an old debate in international law, going back to, you know, the Permanent Court of International Justice, and, you know, what constitutes the domaine réservé. The Frenchman, I'm always happy to be able to use a French term, really, you know, conveys the essence of what's at stake. But I'm kidding. But domaine réservé, you know, it means, you know, basically that, right? Matters that are inherently domestic. But of course, this is international law, so we're not scared of circular definitions, right? I mean, a thing is a thing because it's a thing, right? So the domaine réservé, the question whether a certain matter is or is not solely within the jurisdiction of a state is an essentially relative question. You have to love international law, right? But, you know, the question is, I mean, it's easy to mock, right, as a statement. But, you know, how could it be otherwise, right? But relative to what, right? Relative to just evolving social expectations about what is internal or international. I mean, that's really as vague as it gets, right? And if the definition of interference relies on something as sketchy as that, then no wonder we have trouble pinning it down. But there is, of course, behind all this legacy of Baudin, of Hobbes, of, you know, this idea that there is the state, or think of a Montevideo Convention, right? So the traditional image, a state is a territory, there's the population on the territory, and then there's a governance of just that territory and that population, right? So, and that's kind of a self-enclosed system, and that's a sort of a, you know, how we imagine the international system. So these, you know, separate little boxes which are all doing mostly their thing, you know, between themselves. And the goal of the system is to sort of protect that ability, and obviously no shortage of normative defenses of sovereignty and its sort of inherent value, etc. Okay, so first challenge, I think, can I use the little laser pointer here? Yes. So the first problem is the incessant, this isn't a new 1990s thing, right? But the incessant blurring of a frontier between the domestic and the international. So if you think of the 20th century, the idea of the state itself has now become a major private actor. So the state itself is subverting its own sense of stateness. It's a transactional state. It's a business-oriented state. It's an investor state, right? So so increasingly there's this the de jure imperi domain. So things that are inherently, like, I don't know, the currency or, the criminal justice system is becoming narrower and narrower. And, everything seems to be up for grabs, to involve the state sort of privatizing itself and behaving more like a private actor and therefore, less distinctively public one. The global commons, the United Nations, human rights, the emergence of global issues that suggest that pretty much everything that you do domestically falls under some international treaty commitment or other, has already been heavily internationalized, belies the notion that, there is something that is really strictly domestic, right? So, I mean, a foreign state might say, well, your decisions about your industrial and economic system, that's not an inherently domestic issue because it has huge implications for your carbon emissions and, it's making other states sink, right? This is no longer, I mean, even think of war, right? The extent, if you think of Ukraine or Gaza now, the extent to which that debate is now being framed as one of creating negative externalities, right? It's not just that Russia and Ukraine are fighting it out, it's that in the process, they're creating all of these negative externalities. Think of, the agricultural repercussions for the rest of the world, economic repercussions, security repercussions, etc. Right? So, not even going to war, the decision to go to war, I mean, of all things, is really fundamentally a domestic one. So I don't want to overstate this point. I'm just, maybe calling in question some of the categories that made non-interference and attractive norms, that one that we would want to invest in. So what's the reaction to this? The reaction is to try and renationalize, and to in very broad terms, right? So to say, you know what, we get this globalization, etc., but we're going to build walls again and say, no, like we had a moment of inattention, right? But now we're on it, and we're going to adopt laws, and we're going to sort of insulate the national and the global. So this is happening everywhere, right? I mean, we see it in other areas, right? So that, for example, the attempt to renationalize immigration policy to sort of to reinforce the sense of physically almost the sense of a neat delineation between what's domestic, what's happening on one's territory, and what is happening outside. So it's happening in many ways, and it's just a recurring move, right, across the board. So cyberspace, well, we now have cyber sovereignty, right? So you try to corner a little piece of a vast cyberspace and say, yeah, but there is that part that overlaps with core state functions, or that happens to be mediated by technologies that are on our soil, or that affects our nationals, but, and even though it kind of defies all logic and there's nothing less inherently, domestic than cyberspace, people will try because they feel that's really, I think that they're feeling that the ground is sort of crumbling beneath their feet, right? So there's this sort of panic. We need to redraw the line. Critical infrastructure, another like really interesting domain. So, we've started from, like the armaments industry, for example, and to the grid, water system, and it keeps, the list keeps growing. The pharmaceutical industry, everything becomes a sort of critical infrastructure, right? So you renationalize. Remember the implications of all this. It's not gratuitous. This is, you're preparing the ground for allegations that if you do intrude on that space, potentially you are interfering with domestic effects. So this is all, not just symbolic, it has repercussion. So, one area that's been really interesting, and here I want to kind of suggest some of the limits of the exercise, right? I mean, it's obvious, for example, even with critical infrastructure, why do we need to describe critical infrastructure as inherent, as domestic, and why is it problematic? It's because, why do we have a problem? We have a problem because the only way in which in the last few decades we have ever built that critical infrastructure is by being entirely open. Importing technologies, importing know-how, exchanging, etc. I mean, that was the name of the game, free trade, the open society, that was supposed to be the deal, right? So now we need to be able to have it both ways, right? We want the benefits of the openness because we realize that, the lithium is only in certain countries and the ability to build microprocessors is only in certain countries. So you have to have a bit of openness because you don't want to cut the supply chain, but at the same time, you want to reinstate the controls and say, yeah, but now this is it's a critical industry. And so there's all kinds of protections that come with it. So it's really trying to have it both ways. But it's really clear so democracy, you might think democracy is really inherently domestic. This has got to be, the ability to decide on your own terms. But even that, I mean, who says so, right? Who's as an idea, the idea of even democracy, right? That it has to be domestic. A lot of, democracy is dialogical, involves, and more so, right? I don't know, domestic parties and alliances with similarly minded parties across borders, recomposition of, democratic arrangements on a supranational level, political advisors who circulate with strategies from one country to the next, people who have dual nationality, who can stand for election in two countries, diasporas who vote back in a country of origin, not to mention, democratic theorists who keep telling us that we should be moving, like this whole idea of a bounded kind of Roman, democracy is completely dated. We should be moving to a stakeholder democracy. I mean, there's even some people who argue that, I don't know, South Americans should be able to vote in US elections because they're stakeholders. It's going to make a huge difference for them, right? So if you're impacted, you should be able to vote in election. This is normative theory, right? I mean, it's not about to happen, but it's kind of, it's interesting. Like this idea of a democracy has to be rigidly renationalized. What if you want to get your information from, a Russian news channel or if you want, what if you want to get financial support from abroad, right? I mean, why not? I mean, maybe sometimes it makes sense. Should we assume that it's toxic, right? So very difficult. But I mean, of course, if you're meddling with another state's vote counting systems, that clearly is pretty bad. But the idea of you could neatly, delineate democracy as a purely domestic exercise and then defend that normatively, I think is quite hazardous. Self-determination is sometimes resorted to as, is sometimes invoked. So people say, what's wrong with interference is it corrupts the purity of self-determination. I find that amazing. So it assumes, in moral philosophy and, self-determination is often also an ideal for the individual, right? We self-determine, right? But when it comes to the individual, we all understand that to self-determine and to be free is not to be completely isolated and to make decisions only in your box without ever anyone sort of interfering with your internal psychological space. That would be a really sad, improbable, state to be in, right? So to self-determine, we're constantly self-determining in relation to others, right? Like I make up my mind about what I want to do with my life as a result of, whatever my parents having tried to impose something on me, but I reject it. It's time to wrap up. So anyhow, so all of that's basically the theoretical general framework. I'm obviously taking too long. We have some of the same debates. I'll go a little quicker when it comes to what it takes. So even assuming that we can define kind of naturally determinate sense of the self of the state, of something that is domestic, what does it take? Just keep it simple. We have no reason to think that states are not constantly trying to influence each other and that there's anything wrong with this. This is what states do all the time. This is why there's a diplomacy, which is why there's, which is, and it's fine. I mean, why would we not want states to influence each other, right? And so there's an underlying commitment here to interaction, and interaction, yeah, I mean, involves trying to make arguments and maybe to steer another state away from a decision it might have taken entirely on its own terms. But we don't want to sacrifice that. So look, I mean, as you see, there's all kinds of questions. Is propaganda a form of interference? Is it the fact that influence is covert? Is it destabilization? All of these, I think that kind of laundry list of what constitutes interference needs to be parsed in detail to see what might be potentially wrong with it. And I'll finish with what I think is maybe one of the dangers of this debate, and is the risk of overreaction to the threat of interference. So right now, what we're hearing a lot of is that we're not doing enough to prevent interference. This is kind of a dominant agenda. Certainly in North America, for example, I'd say there's this kind of interference panic right now. So everyone is like, running for new laws, new legislation, new arsenals to deal with interference. I think we need to be mindful of the cost of pushing, a very strong anti-interference agenda without thinking, very clearly about some of the implications and some of the underlying assumptions. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, so we have more and more, a strong sense that we need to do something about fake news. Okay, so we're going to legislate about this. We're going to prohibit the diffusion of fake news. Two things. First, fake news is notoriously hard to define, and there's a lot of very authoritarian regimes that love nothing more than banning fake news. That's kind of, you said something, and so potentially this is very authoritarian. Second, more importantly, we have implicit in this is an association between the foreign interference and fake news. But fake news is emanating all the time from everywhere, right? Including from the heart of a polity. So the idea that this is, specifically, maybe we do have a problem with fake news, but the idea that it's specifically a problem with foreign interference as well, strikes me as wrong and potentially problematic. I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.
That was great. So many ideas, so many new perspectives. I know I have a bunch of questions and things to think about, but we've got about 10 minutes, and I think it would be great to open it up. Maybe we'll take 3 questions at a go and group them. So we've got 1 there, 2 there, and 3 there. Paul?
Shall I go first?
Please.
Thank you very much. I'm leaving aside the colonial or imperialist points that you made at the very beginning, which I'm not doubting them. But in the modern context, is it your suggestion that interference is always negative, or either from the perspective of the target of the interference or from a general welfare point of view? The reason I ask is in the context of Ukraine and the debate, which is fractured, but this idea that the assets that the Russian state has had under embargo, that either those assets should be seized and directed to Ukraine at some point, or that revenue income from those being accrued on those assets, central bank reserves particularly, should be given up. And I was interested to see that on the one hand, there seems to be in the UK, in the courts, a reluctance to involve commercial decisions in this area. But on the other hand, I think, and you'll know better than me, in June this year, the Canadian Special Economic Measures Act was amended in order, apparently, to give the government, federal government, the capacity to seize assets of this kind. Is it negative? Part of the world seems to think that it is. Part of the world seems to think that it's not. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the much needed context and setting the fast scope of this discussion. So excuse me for coming into this room with already many reflections as a human rights practitioner. I guess I anchor that question and back to the Ukrainian example by also like the third world approach to international, by also the fact that like decolonization, it's almost a period in history. If you consider like the trusteeship council has been dormant since 90s, and then like now we're talking about South-South cooperation, and then if you also take into account the say third world response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in comparison maybe to the situation in Gaza, like how would you see like the issue of interference, or like in the context of this evolving world order? And I have two more specific questions. Small one.
We're just going to have to limit it to just one question because there are a few hands.
Okay.
Thanks. If we can keep them short, then we can get a few more in the next round. Please.
Hi, I'm not a lawyer. I barely had any training in international law, but I have thought about like your point that it seems to be a new phenomenon that we see foreign agents interference in elections elsewhere, especially say alleged Russian rigging of the American presidential election, right? It looks like a new challenge, but I had thought about it and would like to point out that around 100 years ago, there was the Third International, the Comintern that's headquartered in Stalin's Moscow, and which had sent their proxies to stand in Czechoslovakia or Hungary's elections after the war. They won the election and then scrapped the democratic system there. So it seems that it looks like a new challenge only because recent scholarship on international non-interference principles, it's very introspective about American imperialism, but not so much other state actors, right? And then the second point I like to make is that
We're limited to one question.
all right, okay, just leave it then. Thank you.
Thanks. Fred, over to you. 3 questions.
Sure. So briefly, so I think
Do you want to turn on your microphone?
sorry, the whole debate
On you know, the seizing of assets, I think I mean, it's a fascinating debate in its own right. I'm not sure how connected it is specifically to the debate on interference. I mean, it involves issues of litigation about property in particular. I mean, let me just suggest a couple of ways in which it might be related to interference. I mean, I don't think the Russians are complaining, but in seizing their assets, their domestic affairs are being interfered with. They're complaining, but it's illegal. I mean, one of the ways in which you justify it, which is also one of the ways in which you would justify interference, is by appealing to very strong, commonly held countervailing norms, right? So we're not, you know, we're not interfering with anything that is domestic because the decision to go to commit a war of aggression was never yours to take in the first place. This was as if you're violating a fundamental international prohibition, then, you know, all bets are off, and you cannot then, you know, invoke your sovereignty, you know, to sort of to push back. That's one aspect. I think another way in which one might say that the seizing, as opposed to just the freezing of assets, is an interference in the sovereign affairs of Russia and perhaps also Ukraine. It's something a bit more complex, but it, you know, something to the effect that you are preempting debates, but at some point ought to implicate Russia's fate as a state and Russian society about a sort of, let's say, I don't know, hypothetically, a kind of transitional justice process at some point in the next 20 years, right? I mean, issues of reparation that have to be, but you can't just substitute your judgment about how these things should be done to another state, and in particular to Ukraine and Russia, and sort of, you know, how they will eventually historically deal with this episode. So the interference here is a sort of a sense that you're preempting debates from the margins, from, you know, just because you happen to have assets that are located in your territory, but you can sort of opportunistically seize. I don't know if that's helpful. It's the first answer. Just on the idea that you know, we can situate decolonization and fight against interference in a certain point in time, and this isn't going on all the time everywhere still. So it's an ongoing battle, right? One way in which one can, you know, explain the relative success of recent coups in West Africa is as part of the continuing politics of non-interference and making good on the promise of decolonization. And I mean, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, etc., decolonized in the sense that they became independent. They hardly got rid of, you know, French interference, right, in their domestic affairs. So it's a, you know, a reality, right? I think at some point, I think the question becomes, you know, how far does one go? I mean, there's, you know, there's a North Korean model to non-interference, right, which is autarky, right, just isolating yourself entirely from the world, and you're sort of more or less guaranteed, but no one will be interfering with your sovereign affairs at a huge cost, right? At the cost of isolation and solipsism, etc. It's not a particularly viable fate, right? So there, you know, there's a constant tension. I mean, it's really defining of what international law tries to do between, you know, retreat and engagement. And international law is being sort of solicited to draw lines that are by nature very difficult to draw. But maybe to go back to link the last comment and the first question. So is interference always negative? Right? It depends. I mean, I think we're going to have two different theories about what is wrong about interference. One way of looking at interference might be it's only wrong when the outcome is wrong, right? So, but interference is right if it, you know, if you're kind of consequentialist, you know, if it improves things. So you might say, this is, you know, by analogy, the debate on humanitarian intervention, right? Might say, well, humanitarian intervention is not inherently wrong. It's only wrong if it makes things worse, but it's actually good if it saves people, right? So with interference in domestic affairs, let's say interference in elections, I mean, you might say, well, interference in the affairs of a brutal dictatorship is not wrong, but, you know, if you're trying to undermine that brutal dictatorship. You know, so by contrast, some people might say there's something inherently wrong about interfering with another sovereign political actor's affairs, regardless of the intention or the outcome. Right? So and so it's more fundamental. You know, so there might still be good outcomes, but they can never entirely say what is wrong about seeking to impose your political judgment on another actor, the act of substitution. Right? And there's a whole, so to go back to debate on humanitarian intervention. There's a whole, tradition going, even in liberalism, going back to Mill, the arduous struggle for self-help that says, you can't save people instead of themselves. All of these things matter because they are done by the people to whom these things apply, and everything is secondary, right? So one can have different views on this. I'll just give you one illustration. Interference in the US election, 2016, and in particular, the release of, Democratic National Committee's emails, and the way that was seen as weakening Hillary Clinton's candidacy and favoring Trump. So here, it's interesting, right? Maybe I don't know about the outcome. I think there's a good or bad outcome. But the point is, this wasn't fake news. It's not that the emails, they made up emails. In some ways, from a democratic point of view, we probably should be grateful that we had this added element. Or the US electors had this added element to make their judgment, right? It was, overall, more information about, more transparency is generally something. But if you're in favor of democracy, you would encourage, right? Now, so if it had been the Washington Post revealing these emails, or some, some US whistleblower, then people might have applauded, right? So, but the thing itself wasn't wrong. It's that it was done by an external actor. Even that, you would have to wonder, like, at the end of the day, does it matter, right? If there's something we really ought to know about a candidate or a party, does it matter? It's a foreigner? Like, how important really is that? Truth is true, right? So what is it, right? Is it that there was a nefarious intention? Okay, maybe, but there always is. People are trying to win elections, right? So domestically, we would never hold that up as a standard, right? So we never, oh, but you did it because you wanted to win the election. Duh, right? That's the whole point. So, yeah, there's something there. I think the idea that, you're not invited at that party, right? So it wasn't you crashing something that you're not meant to be participating in. But still, if you do that in ways that, you're not invited to, let's say, play the poker game, but when you do sit at a table, you're still playing the poker game. You're not trying to, right? So you're still playing by the game that is supposed to be played. Like, I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. I don't have a definitive answer on whether interference can be good. I think interference de facto can have positive outcomes. I think what's important is that from a normative theory perspective, we have to take seriously the fact that regardless of outcomes, there may be something inherently problematic about the very fact of being involved in something that you are not supposed to be involved in. Yeah.
Great. So we've run over time. I'm just going to check with Flora if we have time for one more round of questions or not. Yes? Okay. So we've got one over here, two over here. Anybody else? You can have your second question, sure. Please.
Hello, Professor. I'm a lawyer from mainland China, and I was wondering, everyone is caring about Ukraine, but my focus is on the Israel-Palestine war recently. I want to know how, as to your point of view, how can the interference help resolve such kind of disaster in the Gaza areas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So very quickly, it seems like the project is very interesting, it's very broad. It touches on subjects, sources, it can touch on responsibilities. Suppose that maybe you don't have a answer to this question, but I'm just really curious about the direction in which the project, in which you would like to take the project. Are you looking at one particular area? Are you trying to pull all the strings together? Have you figured that out yet?
Thanks.
Hello. Because we have a tough and fair chair, so just jump to the screening question in my head. It's about like in the same chair, a few weeks back, we have a very senior Chinese diplomat from the foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs also talking about Chinese contribution to the rule of law. And earlier this week on Tuesday, and at the Hong Kong Legal Week, there were also discussion of the long-arm jurisdiction as well as the application of extraterritorial application of Chinese law. I'm not going to trap you about like asking your comments on those, but my questions would rather be about so what would be the principles in jurisprudence or legal doctrines when we come to think about unilateral sanctions? So basically, the liberal argument you have provided on the US side is that like disengagement doesn't mean interference. And then the Chinese approach interpretation is because of the dollar hegemony that is itself interference. So again, I'm not asking for comments, but like to your point of normative theory, how should we be looking at such questions? Thank you.
Sorry, Fred, I'm going to throw in one last question that we have from the gentleman in the middle.
Okay, well, I'll take those maybe in the sort of reverse order. I don't think you can ever be accused of interfering if you are sort of broadly within the political system that you're trying to intervene in. So to influence or to have an intervention in that debate is what we're supposed to be doing all of the time. I think there is an interesting question, though, increasingly, which is, can purely private actors interfere in the affairs of another state? I mean, is that the right word, right? So it's a bit like the debate on aggression, right? So in international law, a lot of lawyers will say a non-state actor cannot commit aggression against another state. Only a state can commit aggression against a state. So, is interference sort of bound into the language of interstate relations? And do we need a new term, maybe, right? I mean, what is Cambridge Analytica doing? Is it interfering, or is it, or is it doing something a bit different? What about the Wagner Group? I mean, Russia is interfering in the affairs of African state. What is the Wagner Group doing? I mean, maybe intuitively we might want to say it's interfering. It's the same thing. There's not much that hangs in the balance, but I think partly one of the challenges we have is whether we need sort of a new vocabulary for these private actors, which make things even more complicated than they already are. On the whether you can interfere by excluding, by not engaging with, separating, I think this is a complex debate that requires subtle answer, and there's no, a lot of the answers are very stereotypical. And I'll give you a Gaza example. I shouldn't be doing this, but it's like the whole debate on whether Israel is still the occupying power in relation to Gaza. And people are completely at loggerheads about this. And people, well, how can you be occupying if you don't have boots on the ground? That's the whole definition of occupying. And then others will say, yeah, how can you not be occupying if you control absolutely every entry point, etc. And it's just one of those endless debates. And I feel like screaming sometimes, saying, look, it can be both at the same time. Like, can't we just have, there's different shades of occupation, and let's at least grant those who don't think it's an occupation of the time, but it is a bit different qualitatively from a full-on, occupation. But let's also make the point that simply because it's not exactly like a full-on occupation doesn't mean it's not an occupation at all. Like, surely we could, have a bit. So I think, my temptation in relation to this is to say, the US, by sort of punishing Cuba for decades, by preventing it from going out into the world, etc. The idea that this is not interference at all is I think a nasty idea, frankly. I mean, it's you could, I mean, it's doing what Israel is doing in relation to Gaza. You kind of, you're sort of controlling all the access points, the access to currency, etc. So we have to think. So here I think we need to move beyond the sort of a formalism, right? And to look at what's actually going on. We need to look at sort of structural advantage and right, but also acknowledge at the same time. But yeah, I mean, the US has a right to trade with, as a sovereign state with who it wants, right? I mean, I mean, then when you sort of actively try to shut out a country from, think of the Iran sanction from any interaction with others, and then you're imposing that policy to third states, that I think it becomes more sort of clearly a form of interference on the kind of project I'm trying to do. So that's a really obviously very important question. So I think there's value in this moment in actually trying, it's completely elusive and one will of course fail, to tie all the threads together. Because I think one of the problems of this debate is few people want to have it while sort of keeping in their mind simultaneously all of these dimensions. It's very easy to go down a rabbit hole and say, oh, I just do cyber interference. All the while forgetting that if you define the problem as one of cyber interference, you already have a very specific agenda. And, and so I think we need to contextualize these debates and their complexity if we're going to sort of do justice to them, even though that's a sort of impossible task. On the normative theory, where I'm going with this, I had, the concluding thoughts, which I think is some of the places I'm going. I'll just point to the third, so irony. So I think we need to rehabilitate a sense of the irony of international legal argumentation. And I don't want to make too much of this, and maybe it's in itself a bit of an ironic sort of conclusion, but there's something to let's just pause for a moment and think about the irony that the West is now making, sort of screening these arguments about non-interference, but it was very skeptical of 20, 30 years. And let's just let that sink in. And let's think a bit about what it means to make arguments that are at loggerheads over time and what it reveals about, the ongoing condition of being a state in the world and etc. So it's more sort of, let's take a pause and just let that sink in. End of story. And then on how interference might help resolve Israel-Palestine. So there's many answers to that. I'll keep it short. So one view is that the whole problem is a problem of, a century of interference in the affairs of a region, right? So this is, with everything. So nothing has been allowed to unfold the way it might have had it not been for this kind of incessant interference in that particular issue, that everyone has an idea, but everyone is kind of, we're never hearing the people, who are most directly impacted. So, partly the call might be to just be quiet, to not be, be dragged in, and to let voices emerge. Partly, there's another dimension to this, which is, I wouldn't quite call it interference, but the opposite picture. So not so much that the world is interfering in the affairs of, of the Palestinians and Israel, etc., but let's say generally that some states, have an outsized influence in the affairs of other states. That might be a problem. I mean, this is a debate that's been had in the US. You can have that debate about many states in relation to many states, right? But that's maybe something that we want to talk about. Again, one has to be very careful, right? And I was going to mention this also before the conclusions, that so my other interest currently is diaspora. I do a lot of work on diaspora, and I think there's a very real risk, for example, in Canada right now, that the debate on interference legitimate as it is. I mean, I think it is legitimate for Canada, a country of immigrants, of many communities, to worry about how politics in other places increasingly affecting politics in Canada. You have to be very careful, right? So, but in the process of resisting that interference, trying to keep it at bay, you don't end up stigmatizing certain communities, by suggesting that they're, for example, a fifth column for another state, right? And a vector of interference. That's sort of, potentially a very dangerous direction to go in. Even as, the reality may also be that sometimes states, do use their diasporas to, weigh in and on the politics of the state. As you know, Canada is now in a big diplomatic spate with India. It's more than interference. I mean, Canada is accusing India of engaging in extrajudicial execution on territorial, on Canadian soil. But we're really feeling like the Indian-Canadian community is now extremely polarized around these issues. And we're feeling something that looks like a form of interference. We can't, I think, quite yet put our fingers on how problematic it is and how we should deal with it. But there's that too. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, we went over time. Questions were great.
Thanks so much, Fred. Let's give him a round of applause.